This is Pokemon Fire Red Leaf Green's most difficult speedrunning category on the main leaderboard. Speedrunners call this Pokemon Fire Red Round 2. And the entire goal of this category is to unlock and beat the harder version of the Elite Four. However, the problems this category presents don't exactly come from beating this upgraded version of the Elite Four, but instead comes from trying to unlock them in the first place. So what exactly are these requirements, and what makes them so difficult to complete in the first place? Well, to start, you need to beat the actual game, which is done pretty easily through using Squirtle the entire game. The second requirement is one I'll get into later, but the third and hardest requirement is having to unlock the National Dex. For a lot of Pokemon games, getting the National Dex is done through just beating the game for the first time. But for Fire Red Leaf Green, you need to have 60 caught Pokemon registered in your Pokedex once you've gotten past the credits. To some, this might not sound that crazy, but one thing you have to consider is just how limited Generation 3 Pokemon games are when it comes to resources. Because in Generation 3, Pokeballs like Quick Balls or Dusk Balls that increase the catch rate of a Pokemon by a ridiculous degree don't exist until the Gen 4 games. This limits us to any balls we can buy or find on the ground. But Ultra Balls, which are the best available balls through shopping, can only be found in very specific shops much later into the game. And in total, there are only 125 Pokemon you can catch or obtain before making it to the credits, with only 85 of them worth catching, essentially forcing us to catch half of the available Pokemon in the game with extremely limited resources. But now that you know all of what we're dealing with, how do speedrunners optimally handle this category with such a stacked goal blocking your path? Well, the best way is to break this list of Pokemon down into categories by asking ourselves, who are the fastest, most valuable Pokemon to obtain along the way, and which ones should you be avoiding at all costs? Starting from Brock to Surge's Gym, the list of Pokemon includes 2 bugs in the forest, stone evolutions, and the ones that can be traded to NPCs. If you take a close look at this list of Pokemon, you'll notice that they all have one thing in common, and that is how easy you can stack multiple dex entries in a row by catching these Pokemon. For example, the bugs in the forest evolve really quickly through switch training, stone evolutions are an easy 2 dex entry, and traded Pokemon like Spearow become even more valuable thanks to how useful Farfetch is with their access to cut and fly, allowing us to delay catching Pidgey and Rattata. While both Pidgey and Rattata are fairly easy catches, you might end up missing out on a high-level rat or bird that can evolve with a single rare candy by catching them too early. But every Pokemon I've listed thus far doesn't even come close to the fastest dex entries you can obtain. That award goes to Pokemon we can buy or pick up for free. Pokemon like the $500 Magikarp, your starter Pokemon, the Freevee in Celadon City, the Lapras from Silphco, and finally, the speed game defining Game Corner Pokemon. You see, the Game Corner prize Pokemon, for some reason or another, have different prices set on them depending on which game you're speedrunning on, which ends up making Fire Red the better game to play on since coins are quite expensive, even if Leaf Green exclusive bonds are easier to catch. But since we're talking about this stage of the game, let's go even further into the sections that truly define how good of a run you're actually on. At this point in the speedrun, you'll have cleared around 3 badges, which opens up most of Kanto to you. And if you want to fully open up Kanto, you're going to need to rush to Koga's gym to unlock and use Surf. So first, we'll need to beat Giovanni, grab his Sylph Scope, and then you can catch or avoid certain mons going from Pokemon Tower to Cycling Road. In total, there are about 3 Pokemon to deserve a spotlight in this section: Ghastly, Cubone, and Snorlax. Ghastly and Cubone are incredibly valuable mons since you can't find them anywhere else in the main story. But unfortunately for Snorlax, it's an example of a bad area exclusive Pokemon. Because as awesome as it would be to catch the Snorlax since you're forced to encounter it anyways, Snorlax's catch rate is just so terrible that throwing any of the Pokeballs we currently have isn't even worth considering. And Snorlax isn't the only Pokemon like this. Because now that we're heading towards Koga's gym, it's time we enter the area above it, made just for catching, the Safari Zone. The best thing about the Safari Zone is you skip the animation for sending out your own Pokemon every single time you see one. The Safari Balls you get in particular are literally just great balls with some ugly paint on them. They have the same exact catch rates and everything, which unfortunately is not a great Pokeball for catching things like Tauros, Chansey, Kangaskhan, Scyther, or Venomoth, and overall makes them worth running away from. As for the other options, throwing rocks doubles the catch rate of a Pokemon and increases its likelihood of fleeing, while bait makes it less likely for a Pokemon to run away. And since speedrunners want to catch the Pokemon in the Safari Zone as fast as possible, they'll never consider using the bait button. Because using bait is only good for when you want to tunnel vision on catching a single Pokemon, which wastes a ton of time and resources from constant breakouts. And while you can get pretty unlucky with fleeing Pokemon through using rocks, the added catch luck you can get on multiple Pokemon is just way too valuable. Speaking of valuable, the Safari Zone is filled with a ridiculous amount of value when taking into account Dex entries. Both Nidorans add up to a total of 6 entries. Execute and Venonat are 2, while the rest that are worth catching have value from being an area exclusive Pokemon. And by the end of the Safari Zone, we can now access 90% of the areas after beating Koga thanks to the HM for Surf. Now, it's important to note at this point that even though we have access to every area, not all of them are worth visiting. Most of the right side of Kanto, including Seafoam Island, will never be visited in this speedrun, since the value of the Pokemon you can catch in those areas isn't worth the effort. Most of the Mons on these routes are either too hard to catch, or you can just find them elsewhere. So instead, speedrunners will be focusing on Power Plant, Pewter City, and Pokemon Mansion. The star Pokemon in these locations will be Pikachu, Magnemite and Voltorb in Power Plant, Aerodactyl, Mr. Mime, and Diglett around Pewter City, and this giant list of area exclusive Pokemon inside of Pokemon Mansion. The only place that is truly mandatory out of these 3 areas at this point is the Pokemon Mansion, since the key to Blaine Gym is inside of it, while Power Plant and Pewter City can be skipped depending on what you've caught thus far. For example, Pokemon like Pikachu and Viridian Forest make the Power Plant completely irrelevant, since the value of Pikachu on its own counts as 3 Pokemon due to a trade NPC wanting a Raichu. And the only other Pokemon there worth grabbing are only a single Dex entry per Pokemon. As for Pewter City, the Pokemon available there are the slowest Pokemon you can possibly obtain in the entire run, because all of them require you to fly, bike, and use the HM for cut to get to them. And while they are very safe to obtain, sometimes the reward is worth the risk of skipping them. But no matter how many places we skip, the next destination will always be Cinnabar Island. This is the location where you can start the side quest needed to unlock the Round 2 Elite Four. And that side quest is the Sevi Islands. For those who've never heard of the Sevi Islands, this is essentially a side plot that takes place on 9 different islands. But only 6 of these islands will be relevant to speedrunners. The first 3 islands will be accessible after beating Blaine. And the best part about these 3 islands is just how many valuable Pokemon are available here. Most of the Pokemon here have multiple obtainable Dex entries. You might even notice a few repeats from the Safari Zone, with the final cherry on top being that you get a free Moonstone for all the hard work you put into this side quest. And once you're done rescuing her, that's pretty much all you gotta do here, since the rest of the Sevi Islands are locked behind receiving the National Dex, making this side quest the big reason why the catch count is needed in the first place. But the thing is, we're not even done catching things at this point, because on average, speedrunners will only have caught about 35 or more Pokemon at this given time. And in order to get this catch count to be higher, we still need to trade with NPCs, use our stones, grab a few more rare candies, and progress through the gyms enough to make it all the way to Victory Road. Even the best of runs will usually have to risk catching high-level fully evolved Pokemon inside of the Indigo Plateau and Victory Road. And while there's still quite a few Pokemon here that aren't fully evolved, beggars can't always be choosers when overworld Pokemon don't exist yet. Which is exactly why this category is as difficult as it is, because not every speedrunner will obtain the exact same list of Pokemon as others. Sometimes the best ones will get away from us, and other times it'll feel like Christmas with how much the game is giving. And you need to know exactly what to do when you're going through both situations. Do you start skipping Pokemon just because your catch count is really high? Do you stay in one area for longer just to be safe if your catch count is lower? Do you start throwing Pokeballs instead when you're running low on Ultra Balls? Knowledge is the ultimate power in all of these situations, And even the folks who speedran this category for years are still figuring out all the possible options you can explore. And if the experts still don't know everything there is, I think that truly adds to how crazy the difficulty of understanding this category actually is. While it is the main battle speedrunners have to deal with throughout the entire category, it's not the entire battle that needs to be fought. Because with the 60th Pokemon finally registered in our Pokedex, we can proceed into the round 1 Elite Four. And as long as the fights go well, we can go straight to the Hall of Fame, soft reset to skip the credits. Then with 60 Pokemon registered as caught in our decks, Professor Oak will immediately give us the National Dex, letting us access the second half of the Sevii Islands. The second island quest has you finding a Ruby and a Sapphire to upgrade a machine that lets you trade to the Hoenn region games. Blocking your path to success will be quite a few Team Rocket members who have yet to realize that you defeated Giovanni. These fights start off quite simple, but get progressively harder as time goes on. The final 4 Team Rocket battles in particular are a massive RNG fest for Blastoise with all the status moves on these Pokemon. And all we really have to combat this is a single Lumberry and a couple of full restores. Once this massive rocket section is cleared, we can finally move on to the entire point of this video, the Round 2 Elite Four. Each of the Round 2 Elite Four is stacked with multiple Johto Pokemon in their party, and unfortunately, our Blastoise is not going to be enough to take him down. You see, there's one thing you might have noticed throughout this entire process of catching things. I have yet to mention the single Master Ball that we get inside of Silphco, and that's because the best mon to use it on is Mewtwo, the Pokemon that will be taking down the Round 2 Elite Four. If you played even an ounce of Pokemon, then you know exactly how powerful Mewtwo is. But it also takes forever to reach it inside of Cerulean Cave. Because of this, you might be wondering, why exactly is it worth catching it in the first place then? And why can't Blastoise just beat the Round 2 E4 on its own? Well, the problem isn't that it can't beat it on its own, it's that it just doesn't do it fast enough for it to be worth it. Because as of this video, the only mons worth using on their own are Charizard, Zapdos, and Mewtwo. Zapdos inside of the power plant was originally the fastest Pokemon to use for the end of this category. This was mostly due to how much Blastoise struggled in the Elite Four before I brought forward the Black Glasses strategy to speedrunners. This strategy changed the landscape of Pokemon Fire Red Leaf Green speedruns forever, and made many of the fights much better thanks to the power of Bite, saving at least a minute of time, if not more. But more importantly, Blastoise could handle the first round of gyms and Elite Four much better than Zapdos when equipped with Black Glasses, which ended up making Mewtwo the faster Pokemon to commit a Master Ball to. As for Charizard, if the current Charizard Elite Four Round 2 route came out during Zapdos' Reign of Terror, it would have taken the spot as the fastest route. But there's really no doubt at this point in time that Mewtwo plus Blastoise is easily the fastest choice for speedrunning. The only downside to catching Mewtwo are the fact that your Blastoise's level is low enough that certain encounters inside of Cerulean Cave can spawn through your repel, and almost every one of them is really fast, making it that much harder to run away. Well, the other problem comes from the random stats and nature of your Mewtwo. Most Mewtwo's will be powerful enough to beat the Elite Four Round 2 without any problem, but one bad stat can mean disaster for a Round 2 speedrun. The most important stat on Mewtwo is Special Attack followed by Attack. This is due to most of the Elite Four Round 2 fights using special attacks like Psychic and Fire Blast, but the final fight uses Earthquake. Previously, this entire Elite Four Round 2 section focused around Mewtwo's special attack, but it was eventually found out to be faster to just use the Earthquake TM we get from Giovanni, all thanks to the previous route using Calm Mind, which produces an animation that we can't turn off. But with enough power in both stats, Lorelei, Bruno, Agatha, and Lance get absolutely obliterated by Psychic, Fire Blast, and a couple of X specials. Then all our Round 2 champion needs is just enough X attacks to clear this very difficult category, ending what I would call the hardest category in Pokemon Fire Red Leaf Green. If you enjoy this long adventure through this wild category, consider subscribing for more Pokemon speedrunning news and content.